Okay guys, welcome to chapter 24, The West Between the Wars. As you guys can see on this overview slide of chapter 24, what happened between World War I and World War II, there was an age of prosperity, the 20s, followed by a financial depression. This low economic place led to the rise of totalitarian leaders. People needed something and somebody to believe in to make them feel good about themselves, their country, and the future that they were hoping to have. So as you look, the political and economic changes, the rise of totalitarianism, and the innovations and ideas that came out of it, this is basically the summary of the entirety of chapter 24. Section 1, the futile search for stability. The peace settlement at the end of World War I left many nations unhappy and border disputes simmering throughout Europe. The League of Nations, which was the group of people put together to provide peace, actually proved a weak institution. Economic problems plagued France, Great Britain, and German Weimar Republic. When Germany declared that it could not continue to pay reparations, the fees that they were charged at the end of the war for the damage they had done, France decided to occupy the Ruhr Valley as a source of reparations. They wanted payment, so they went in there and went to the factories to collect. The Dawes Plan reduced the burden of reparations and led to a period of prosperity and American investment in Europe. Democracy was widespread, and women in many European countries gained the right to vote. The prosperity ended with the economic collapse of 1929 and the Great Depression. European governments tried different approaches at ending the Depression. With the Great Depression, many extremist parties gained political support. A new U.S. President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, pursued a policy of active government intervention in the economy that became to be known as the New Deal. Now, as we go to the next slide, that was the overview of Section 1. It doesn't mean that those things were successful. It just means that that is what happened. So, the League of Nations, you can see that Section 1, it has these 4 sections. A weak League of Nations, French demands, inflation in Germany, and the Treaty of Locarno. So the League of Nations, we talked about last chapter, it was, of course, the group of people that got together to try and keep peace in Europe. The League of Nations was an intergovernmental organization funded as a result of the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War. It was the first international organization whose principal mission was to maintain world peace. You would probably think of this as the UN today. The U.S. never joined, making it an extremely weak League of Nations, and nations could not approve of using force against aggression. Now, as far as France goes, the French wanted Germany to pay their debt from World War I, which in their mind was $33 billion. By 1922, Germany said they could not pay. So France decided to send the troops into this industrial area of Germany to collect the money by basically skimming the money off the top from the mines and the factories. Obviously, this is not good neighborly relations between these two countries who have just fought a war against each other. So all of this leads to inflation in Germany, which we're experiencing here in the United States, so you should be familiar with all of these terms. German workers went on strike and refused to work for the French. Germany just printed more money. I've heard many students tell me, why don't we just print more money? Well, because money has to be backed by gold in order to give it value. The only way that money has value is if it's backed by something that is actually worth anything. The paper it's printed on is not actually worth anything. In 1914, 4.5, the German mark equaled $1, okay? By November of 1923, it was 130 billion marks equaled $1. And by the end of that month, that same year, it was 142 trillion marks equaled $1. So it was absolutely worthless. The final column, Treaty of Locarno, written by France and Germany, it guaranteed Germany's western borders with France and Belgium. It seemed to encourage peace. Germany joined the League of Nations. It was weak because it was just a promise and did not have enforcement to back it up. So there really wasn't anything with this treaty that would really help out. Now, if you guys look at this, it's about the Great Depression. And so you can kind of see the causes and the responses on this particular little graph. The prices on farm goods dropped. This also and the U.S. stock market crashed. And many people withdrew funds, from Germany. So those are the causes of the Great Depression. Now the responses, 40% of Germans were out of work. Governments did not know how to handle this. Governments became very involved in economic affairs, increasing Marxist ideas. You can see that in our own country as our government became involved in the AIG and some of the investment companies and taking them over and giving them loans, as well as the car companies that were like Chrysler. Ford did refuse that, but remember, those things are exactly what was happening as we were heading into a recession. Our government started taking over private businesses, which is not supposed to be what happens in capitalism. And then you can see what it ended up being like during this time period. So what we have here is another section of chapter 1, the democratic states after the war. So Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States. Well, Germany had the Weimar Republic, had many problems. Inflation, no real leader other than Hindenburg. And I wanted you to see, because there were Zeppelins, and they were, one of them was named after Hindenburg, and it's a very famous accident that happened. France became the strongest European power in the 1930s, brought political chaos. People that were politically left, communists and socialists from the Popular Front of government. They started collective bargaining, the right for unions to negotiate with employers to get a 40-hour work week and 2 weeks paid vacation, which is something we seem to all have in this country and not even think about where it started. In Great Britain, lost much of its industry to the United States and Japan. This led to unemployment. The Labour Party lost control of to the Conservatives. They brought Great Britain out of the Depression, and John Keyes felt the government should spend their way out of the Depression. You can see here to the last two pictures are about the United States. After Germany, the U.S. was the worst hit by the Depression. 12 million people were unemployed. My grandfather was one of them. President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, created the New Deal, where the government became more involved in putting people back to work. The New Deal did not solve unemployment. Okay, so the government getting involved in private affairs did not work, but World War II did. One of the things that it did do in our own valley was it provided jobs for people out at Hoover Dam. People came from all over the country to work and build Hoover Dam, and they lived in areas around Boulder City. And for a while there, it was called Boulder Dam. So these few section review questions are found here for you. You can see it basically says, which of the following is not a reason why peace was short-lived after World War I? And we would say it's because Germany and France signed the Treaty of Locarno. And the economist John Maynard Keynes advocated increased government spending as a remedy for economic depression. And so that sends us into section 2. So, the rise of dictatorial regimes. In 1939, most European democracies had collapsed. Only France and Great Britain remained democratic. Benito Mussolini began his political career as a socialist, but he abandoned socialism for fascism, which glorified the state and justified suppression of all political dissent. In Italy, Mussolini outlawed most political opposition and controlled the mass media, but never achieved complete totalitarian control. After the Russian Civil War, Lenin restored capitalist practices in his new economic policy, which prevented economic and political collapse. After Lenin's death, however, Joseph Stalin emerged as the most powerful communist figure. Stalin sidelined the Bolsheviks of the revolutionary era and established a totalitarian rule. His program of rapid industrialization and collectivization of agricultural forced horrendous sacrifices on the population. His political purges caused millions to be arrested, imprisoned, and executed. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in the Francisco Franco Spain, authoritarian regimes were mainly concerned with preserving the existing power. Now, I have had the privilege, as I go to the next slide, of seeing the dead body of Lenin because it is, in fact, mummified and still located in Red Square in a mausoleum. And his buddy at one time, Joseph Stalin, you see up here to the right, he was the leader of the USSR, which I have an arrow going to it. He was a powerful position in the USSR and took advantage by grabbing power from Lenin Trotsky, who they amazingly later found murdered. So Joseph Stalin killed more people, more than the 12 million that the gentleman to his left killed. So if you can imagine all of the things we attribute to Adolf Hitler, the guy to the right with a different mustache killed more of them. Adolf Hitler joined the Workers' Party. It's very right-wing, extreme nationalism. By 1921, he controlled the party. And you can see down below, it was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Forgot a few letters there, sorry about that. As we slide down, there's good old Benito Mussolini, looking much better than when he is hung upside down and killed, which you can look up pictures for yourself on Google of. Established the first European fascist movement in Italy. Fascism glorifies the state above individual with a strong central government. He formed bands of, and I'm just going to say black shirts, to attack socialists. This gave him support from the landowners. And then we see here Francisco Franco. Mustaches do seem to be a theme amongst these gentlemen. Led forces against the Spanish government. Italy and Germany sent forces to help. Troops were also sent from the U.S. and the USSR to volunteer to help to fight against him. Franco established a dictatorship with an authoritarian, not totalitarian. He used the newspapers also to spread propaganda. So you can see how basically these large, powerful governments were being carved up in Europe at this time. In a review section, we can see 3 particular questions here, which is not a characteristic of the totalitarian states that emerged. The leaders required only passive obedience from their subjects. Totalitarianism in Italy under Mussolini involved the use of newspapers to spread propaganda. And in order to strengthen his control over party bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, Stalin purged those who threatened his political power. Boy, so much power is listed in one tiny word like purged, and it killed so many people. I did have the opportunity to live in Russia for a summer, and it was amazing to say the least. So now we go into Hitler and Nazi Germany, which this section is so much bigger than we're going to cover that I suggest you A, read this in the book, and B, just when you hit something that's interesting, do a Google search. At the end of World War I, Adolf Hitler joined a small right-wing extremist party in Munich and eventually became its leader. Hitler staged an uprising against the government in Munich, the Beer Hall Purst, which failed. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, an account of his movement and his views. Out of prison, he expanded the Nazi Party in Germany. His democracy broke down. Right-wing elites looked to Hitler for leadership. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Amid constant chaos and conflict, Hitler used terror and repression to gain totalitarian control. Meanwhile, a massive rearmament program put Germans back to work. Mass demonstrations and spectacles rallied Germans around Hitler's policies. All major institutions were brought under Nazi control. Women's primary role was to bear Aryan children, like a nursery. Hitler's Nuremberg laws established official persecution of Jews. Please look that up online. A more violent anti-Semitic phase began in 1938 when the Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, a night of broken glass, increasingly drastic steps barred Jews from attending school, earning a living, or engaging in Nazi society. Jews were also encouraged to immigrate, which means leave the country. Remember, immigrate with an E means to exit. So we have here basically some of Hitler's views, the rise of the Nazis, the victory of Nazism, and the Nazi state. I know you'll be asked a question about a timeline of these events, so please pay attention. He was born in Austria, failed secondary school, wanted to be an artist, went down to Austria, or went to try and do that, served 4 years on the Western Front during World War I. In 1919, joined the German Workers' Party, very right-wing. 1921, controlled the party. 1923, staged the armed uprising that was discussed earlier and went to prison where he wrote Mein Kampf, a book about German nationalism linked to social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the pecking order that you find in your own classroom, where some people think they're better than others and rise above them and then persecute those who are less fortunate in your midst. They're in your room. The rise of Nazis. Nazis would need to gain power legally. In 1929, Nazis were a national party, so it didn't take them long to completely cover the entire nation. Like the Democrats or the Republicans, in Parliament, which was called the Reichstag, Hitler promised a new Germany with jobs, showing national pride. The victory of Nazism, well, by 1930, the president was Hindenburg, and by 1933, they had made Hitler chancellor, and that allowed him to create a new government. Parliament, as crazy as those guys were at that point, passed something called the Enabling Act, which allowed the government to ignore the Constitution. Imagine that happening in the United States. Sometimes we think it is happening, but imagine it actually happening. It gave Hitler all of the power. And so concentration camps were set up for people who opposed them. By 1933, Germany was a totalitarian state. From 1933 to 39, Aryan state was to be established. The Third Reich. The First Reich was the Roman Empire, and Hitler felt that they were German, Aryan. And the second one was the German Empire up until that point. And then the terror was used to control people. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were passed, which excluded Jews from German citizenship, forbade marriages between Jews and Germans, and by 1941, yellow stars were being forced to be worn by all Jewish people. And then in 1938, we have the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, a destructive rampage against the Jews. As you look at this particular slide, we can see we can see Benito Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler. Now, we lump Stalin in here, but ironically, he ends up fighting against these two people and on our side during this time. So that doesn't seem to be the case when we look at this, but you could see what country they were the leader of. You could see what their title was, date when they came to power, Hitler being the last, what political party they were a part of, what type of government they had, the sources of support that they had, methods of controlling opposition. So you can see the SS for Hitler. And of course he had propaganda, state-run press. When the state controls the press, there is no freedom of the press. And then their policies. For Mussolini, support of the Catholic Church, nationalism, anti-socialism, anti-communism. And then the 5-year plan of rapid industrialization, collectivization of farms. And he was actually an atheist in Stalin's time, so he wouldn't have agreed with Mussolini on that support of the Catholic Church. Rearmament, public projects, put the people to work, anti-Semitism, racism, social Darwinism, extreme nationalism. So now we have our summary page of questions to this particular time period. As you can see, who aided Francisco Franco in his revolt against the democratic government in Spain? Germany. Mein Kampf, Hitler expressed favorable views on nationalism. And Hitler gained the power in Germany by becoming chancellor. Winston Churchill to the right will eventually become the leader of England. His mother was American. She was a very wealthy American that married a titled British man. After World War I, radio and film became sources of entertainment as well as propaganda tools. Hitler and the Nazis made wide use of both. 8-hour workdays allowed many people to enjoy mass leisure activities. So people didn't have leisure activities before this. They worked or they didn't work, but they didn't have activities, such as professional sporting events, as well as train, bus, and car travel. The uncertainty of the post-war world became a prominent theme in art. Dadaism and the surrealism of Salvador Dali reflected absurdity in the world. Nazi art was intended to be a new German art form. In fact, it was largely derived from 19th century folk art. Literary interests in the unconscious produced the stream of consciousness technique by James Joyce's Ulysses. The German novelist Hermann Hesse was influenced by psychology and Asian religions. The revolution in physics began by Albert Einstein, continued through the 1920s with Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So that's a summary, and you can see these amazing pictures here in section 4. And of course, we see Salvador Dali on this. He's very, very famous. You will probably never realize how much Salvador Dali that you've actually seen. The high priest of surrealism. He painted everyday objects but spread them from their normal context by placing recognizable objects in unrecognizable relationships. Hitler did not like this form of art. He thought it was degenerate and believed that they could create a new, genuine German art. Very nationalist. Salvador Dali, you see himself in the center there. He himself was quite a character. Made himself almost as crazy as his paintings. Now the ideas, we have the modern art between the wars, the Dada movement and surrealism. The Dada movement was the world doesn't make sense, so why should art? Life has no purpose. Hannah Höcht was one of these people in the Dada movement. Portrayed fantasy, dreams, and nightmares. Salvador Dali, recognizable objects in unrecognizable places. And finally, the heroic age of physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principles. Subatomic particles are unpredictable. This challenged Newton's theory. Albert Einstein continued working. And then we have the final look in the review.